December 16, 1944. Private First Class. James McKinney crouched in a foxhole near Bastogne, Belgium, watching his breath crystallize in air so cold it burned his lungs. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds that drove the chill factor far lower, turning the Ardennes forest into a landscape more hostile than any enemy. Around him, American soldiers huddled in positions dug through frozen earth, wearing uniforms designed for temperate European climates, inadequate for the worst winter in decades. 3 hours earlier, German artillery had shattered the pre-dawn silence, followed by panzer columns that smashed through thinly held American lines in an offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Now, as daylight revealed the scope of the attack, McKinney and thousands of other American soldiers faced a crisis that was as much environmental as military. The cold was killing men as efficiently as German guns. Frostbite was turning fingers and toes black within hours of exposure. Weapons froze and would not fire. Vehicles would not start. Radios failed. Food froze solid. Water in canteens turned to ice. The deep freeze that gripped the Ardennes in December 1944 threatened to accomplish what German tactical skill could not: stop the American advance and perhaps break the Allied coalition through sheer environmental attrition. In the desperate hours and days that followed, survival would depend not just on tactical responses to German assault, but on systematic solutions to cold weather warfare that would test American logistical and organizational capabilities to their limits. The historical context that made the Ardennes winter so catastrophic began not with weather but with strategic surprise. American commanders, confident that Germany lacked resources for major offensive operations, had thinly manned the Ardennes sector with units recuperating from earlier battles or fresh divisions gaining experience. The German assault on December 16th concentrated overwhelming force against unprepared defenders, creating breakthrough conditions that tactical manuals described but commanders hoped never to face. The initial German success was amplified by weather that grounded Allied air power, the decisive American advantage in every previous major engagement. For several days, American ground forces fought without the close air support they had come to rely upon. Without reconnaissance flights to reveal German positions, without interdiction strikes against supply columns, the weather that trapped Allied aircraft on runways also trapped American soldiers in positions where cold became as deadly as combat. Casualty reports from the first week of fighting listed thousands of frostbite cases alongside combat wounds, men whose war ended not through German action, but through environmental exposure that medical services were unprepared to handle. American military planning had anticipated fighting in Northern Europe across multiple seasons, but the intensity and duration of the December freeze exceeded worst-case assumptions. Soldiers whose uniforms included field jackets and wool layers found them insufficient against sustained exposure to sub-zero temperatures with inadequate shelter. The expectation among American troops had been that winter warfare in Europe, while uncomfortable, would be manageable through standard cold weather gear and field procedures. The reality they encountered was far more brutal and far more complex than anticipated. Men discovered that foxholes, essential for survival against German fire, became cold traps where men could not move sufficiently to maintain body heat. Soldiers who removed gloves to operate weapons or field equipment experienced frostbite within minutes. Boots, designed for mobility and durability, provided inadequate insulation against sustained cold, leading to epidemic levels of trench foot, the same condition that had plagued armies in World War I, where tissue damage from cold and moisture caused permanent injury and often required amputation. Sleeping bags, where available, provided warmth only if soldiers could keep them dry, an impossibility in positions where snow and ice were constant. The contrast between what troops expected, manageable cold that standard gear could address, and what they experienced, life-threatening, environmental conditions that required constant vigilance. To avoid injury, created psychological as well as physical crisis. Men began to fear the night, knowing that hours of relative immobility in defensive positions could mean frostbite casualties even without German action. Company commanders faced impossible choices: maintain defensive alertness that required soldiers to remain exposed, or allow troops to seek shelter in ways that compromised tactical positions. The symbolic object that came to represent the battle against cold was humble, but literally life-saving: the wool blanket. American forces had blankets in their supply system, olive-drab wool items that were standard issue and unremarkable in normal conditions. In the Ardennes freeze, wool blankets became precious as ammunition. Soldiers wrapped them around shoulders under field jackets, lined foxholes with them, used them to insulate weapons to prevent freezing, shared them in pairs to pool body heat during rest periods. The blankets represented something fundamental about American military logistics: the assumption that soldiers' basic welfare needs would be met through systematic supply. German forces, by contrast, struggled with chronic supply shortages that meant many soldiers lacked adequate winter gear. Despite years of fighting on the brutal Eastern Front, the wool blanket was not sophisticated technology or tactical innovation, but evidence of a supply system that had anticipated needs and delivered in volume. As the battle developed and American logistics adapted to crisis conditions, blankets became a priority item. Thousands shipped to Bastogne and other critical points, distributed based on assessment that keeping soldiers alive and functional was as important as delivering ammunition. The blankets symbolized the American approach to warfare that Hitler had mocked, but that proved decisive. The willingness to invest in soldiers' welfare, to treat comfort and survival as military necessities rather than luxuries, to build supply systems that anticipated needs rather than merely responding to crises. The transformation in American approach to cold weather warfare occurred not through pre-battle planning but through desperate adaptation under extreme conditions. Medical personnel, overwhelmed by frostbite casualties, developed triage protocols to distinguish between injuries requiring immediate evacuation and those that could be treated at battalion aid stations. Field commanders implemented procedures for rotating troops from forward positions to heated shelters for minimum periods, accepting tactical risk to preserve force capability. Supply officers prioritized cold weather equipment: blankets, dry socks, fuel for heaters, insulated rations, alongside ammunition and medical supplies. Quartermasters improvised solutions for problems that had not been anticipated, delivering hot coffee to forward positions in insulated containers, distributing petroleum jelly to prevent facial frostbite, providing gasoline-fired heaters to warm vehicles enough to start engines. The systematic response emerged not from central planning, but from distributed problem-solving at multiple levels, each addressing aspects of the cold weather challenge with whatever resources and authority they possessed. This distributed adaptation reflected strength of American military culture that German planners consistently underestimated: the ability of junior officers and NCOs to improvise solutions without waiting for headquarters directives, the flexibility to adjust procedures based on observed results, the assumption that everyone from private to general was responsible for finding solutions rather than merely executing orders. The historical evidence of the struggle against cold appears in unit records, medical reports, and personal accounts that detail the systematic nature of environmental casualties. The 106th Infantry Division, experiencing its first combat, the Ardennes, suffered 416 frostbite casualties in the first 48 hours of fighting, more than its combat casualties in the same period. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed to Bastogne and surrounded there, reported that maintaining warmth for wounded soldiers awaiting evacuation became as critical as combat operations themselves. After-action reports noted that weapons maintenance procedures had to be modified because lubricants froze, rendering M1 Garands and other firearms inoperable. Tank crews discovered that ammunition stored in cold vehicles required warming before firing to prevent malfunctions. Artillery units found that frozen ground and extreme temperatures affected trajectory calculations. Every aspect of military operations was complicated by cold that exceeded planning assumptions. But American forces adapted. The systematic response included establishing heated shelters in rear areas where troops could recover from exposure, distributing dry socks and insulated boots to replace inadequate standard footwear, teaching field procedures for preventing frostbite through constant movement and buddy checks, prioritizing fuel for heating over other uses when conditions demanded, evacuating severe frostbite cases to prevent permanent injury. Each adaptation required resources, blankets, fuel, specialized equipment, medical capacity, and American logistics delivered them. The sound that characterized the Ardennes battle was not the thunder of artillery or roar of engines, but something quieter and more persistent. The chattering of teeth, the involuntary shivering of men pushed to the edge of hypothermia, the constant movement soldiers made to maintain circulation and prevent freezing. This sound, inaudible individually but pervasive across units, represented the war within the war, the struggle against environment that preceded and underlay tactical operations. German soldiers, many veterans of the Eastern Front's brutal winters, recognized these sounds from experience. They had their own struggles with cold, but German supply systems, strained to breaking, could not provide adequate winter equipment even for priority offensive units. American soldiers, hearing their own teeth chatter and their buddies stamping feet to maintain warmth, were experiencing conditions that German forces had faced for years, but with one critical difference. American logistics was adapting, delivering solutions, treating cold weather survival as a problem requiring resources, rather than merely endurance. The sound of suffering was the same. The systematic response was different. American medical evacuations removed frostbite casualties to hospitals where treatment could prevent permanent injury. American supply lines delivered blankets, heaters, insulated clothing, hot rations. American organizational culture accepted that environmental conditions were combat factors requiring logistical response rather than evidence of insufficient martial spirit. By Christmas 1944, as German offensive momentum stalled and American forces stabilized defensive lines around Bastogne and elsewhere, the crisis of cold had been addressed, if not solved. Casualty rates from frostbite declined as procedures improved and equipment arrived. Soldiers learned which techniques prevented injury and which comfortable-seeming behaviors, removing boots in foxholes, seeking warmth near idling vehicle exhausts, actually increased risk. The distributed knowledge system of American military culture meant that survival techniques discovered by one unit were shared laterally through informal networks faster than official channels could distribute written procedures. The wool blankets that had become symbols of survival were supplemented by more sophisticated equipment. Insulated boots, cold weather parkas, sleeping bags designed for sub-zero temperatures, portable heaters. Each item represented supply system response to observed needs, industrial capacity brought to bear on tactical problems. The American approach to warfare that treated material solutions as appropriate responses to military challenges. When weather cleared and Allied air power returned to operation, German offensive collapsed under combined weight of tactical containment and logistical strangulation. But even after German threat receded, cold remained factor through winter of 1944-45, and American forces continued adapting, continued improving cold weather capabilities, continued treating soldier welfare as military necessity rather than luxury. The epilogue of the Ardennes freeze was written not in immediate aftermath, but in transformation of American military doctrine, regarding environmental factors. The near disaster of December 1944 demonstrated that tactical excellence and material abundance could be negated by environmental conditions if those conditions were not systematically addressed. Post-war analysis identified failures in planning, procurement, and training that had left American forces vulnerable to predictable winter conditions. The Army responded by developing comprehensive cold weather warfare doctrine, specialized equipment, and training programs that assumed environmental challenges required systematic preparation rather than improvised response. The wool blanket remained in the supply system, but it was joined by layered clothing systems, extreme cold weather gear, and procedures for preventing cold weather injuries that became standard training for all troops. The lesson absorbed was that modern warfare required attention to every factor affecting combat effectiveness, that soldiers were systems requiring multiple inputs to function optimally, and that industrial societies with sufficient resources should invest in protecting their personnel against environmental as well as enemy threats. The sound of chattering teeth faded from American positions as doctrine evolved, replaced by systematic responses that treated cold as an enemy admitting of defeat through proper equipment and procedures. The deep freeze that nearly stopped the war had instead taught lessons that made American forces more capable, more resilient, more systematic in addressing challenges beyond direct combat. The wool blanket, humble and unglamorous, remained the symbol of that transformation. Evidence that freedom's greatest strength was not merely ability to produce weapons, but willingness to invest in keeping the people who used those weapons alive, functional, and treated as valuable resources deserving protection rather than expendable assets, accepting suffering as natural condition of service.